Let's move on and get to the main event. We're really grateful to host the launch of Z Books imprint and to bring up our panelists tonight who'll talk about Glenn O'Brien, Alix Browne, David Colman, Ken Hastreiter, and Michael Hainey. Please welcome them to the stage.
Interaction.
I did write a lot, but now
I love apartment, so I think it's such a great.
Now?
I'm not going first. You're going first. I go last, right? Or I go first? I don't know. Are we supposed to all go out?
You're all very dark and murky.
Are we supposed to all come out?
yes.
Sorry.
Oh, Duncan's here.
Hi, everybody.
Kim Hastreiter, Michael Hainey, Alix Browne, and the amazing Colman.
And Glenn.
And Glenn.
Glenn.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Scene.
The crime scene.
Thank you so much for coming. Great to have such a nice crowd. Thank you for, welcome to this panel discussion about Glenn O'Brien and his new book, which is Intelligence for Dummies, which the best title I've heard in about 10 years. And I'm just going to go right into this rather than blathering on like an idiot and ask our panelists, to describe their early memories of Glenn in a way that sort of gets at how strange a creature he was. I'm going to start with Kim because you probably had the earliest.
I mean, I remember watching his party show, house party.
TV party.
Right.
TV party, yeah. And I was very dear friends with Paige Powell at Interview.
Of course, yeah.
And, Paige and Glenn worked, and we all had trade at the Odeon, so we would all eat at the Odeon. And I kind of met Glenn in those days. It was in the 80s. And he was at Interview, then I started Paper. And, but then when Andy died and Glenn left and everything changed, my partner, David Hershkovitz, asked Glenn to do a column for Paper, which he did. And I didn't edit Glenn, my partner David did. So I never really knew him as his editor. But, he was a very scary, I said the word scary, but no, he was a strong presence. And he would, at Paper, we didn't have money, so we would just the deal was you could do whatever you wanted, and we wouldn't ever touch your word. So people could he would just bring up whatever he brought, we would publish every month. And I guess the biggest lesson, something that really stands out is it was a DIY magazine paper. I did it in my house. I didn't know anything. And this girl who was the editor at the New York Times named Amy Spindler. I don't know if any of you ever heard of her. She was the fashion editor. She was kind of a big deal. She kind of discovered us and nurtured us and gave us this big story. And we were kind of all like, we were very young and excited. And then, so she became a good friend of mine. And then one day Glenn brings in his column and my partner comes into my office and said, oh, Glenn wrote this column. That was like kind of really, Amy had written something in the New York Times about heroin chic. It was like a trend, and it was very controversial, and all the designers were making like models look like they were on heroin. And then Glenn wrote this scathing, like he skewered her in this article. And it was my first, and we ran it, we weren't going to change it or run it. We never even told Glenn, but Amy never spoke to me again after that and felt I had betrayed her. It was like my first lesson of like the horror of being I don't know, being an editor, I guess. I grew up at that point, I guess, as an editor. So I lost a friend, but Glenn never even knew. We never told him because that was
now.
He knows now.
Yeah, sorry,
He's
Glenn.
fighting with Amy Spindler up there right
I know.
now, and or down there.
Front row in heaven.
It's a good story. I mean, it's one of the things that was interesting about Glenn was that he was such a study in contradictions. He could be very smooth and gracious, but he could also just be like a
terror.
Thank you.
But he was very strong in his opinions, and and he was a curmudgeon, but he had like this incredible eye, had this incredible brain and incredible humor. And if he liked something that you did, like, if he gave me a compliment on something that I did, it was like, oh my God, I won the Academy Award. It was like the biggest thing ever. And so he was opinionated, and I was a little scared of him.
I think that was part of, just to jump in on that, I mean, part of what's, Glenn he was this mix of opposites, and I think people had perceptions of him, because he had this persona, and if you didn't know him and he'd walk into a room, they would perceive or project a lot of things onto him. But I think when you got to know him, and I mean, I have my own readings of him, obviously, but this was a guy who grew up in Cleveland and lost his father and went to Georgetown, and there was always, I think, deep inside of him, there was this code. He had this moral code, and a code about, I think, how he saw what was right and wrong in the world. And I would always say that he was not. I always thought it was interesting. He was not a snob. His stuff could read snobby, but he was not a snob. In fact, he was very democratic and very open to everything. And I think that was almost what I would imagine Andy instilled in him.
Except for mediocrity.
Right,
I don't think he liked anything that was mediocre.
I think that's the other thing, is he was not a snob, and yet he hated phonies.
Yeah.
So that was the thing, and it was one of those New York sort of, you had to know where that line was, and he could spot those. He could spot the phony, and he could also, but he also, I would say, that line I would use. He was snobby about snobs. He hated snobs, and so that was one of the many joys.
But he loved great work. So
Yes.
whoever you were,
right, and that's the democratic view of him.
Yes,
It
exactly.
didn't matter high, low.
Yeah.
He could, and his eye was just so attuned to good work,
Yeah,
whatever the source of
about
that
the work.
was.
It's interesting because, with the Style Guy, the column that he wrote for GQ with you, right? And with you a little, right?
I never touched a word.
Oh, yeah.
I just
But just to expand on what you're saying, you might think, oh, this is going to be the column of traditional, like you have to do it this way, right? Like the thing that used to be in men's magazines all the time. And he would take delight in some little kind of old details of gentlemanly attire, but he also would just as quick to be like, lose that cummerbund or whatever, like, don't bother with this stupid, stuffy, expensive habit that's nobody cares about.
He wasn't trying to sell you something.
Right, exactly.
He was like the Emily Post in a way, but.
Yeah, but it wasn't proper,
But I think everything
necessarily.
he wrote for that, it was always about the deep lesson of it all was being individual, right? And I think that was part of the message that Glenn put out in the world. His voice was individual, and he was always, I think, whatever you read, I think his mission, whether he would admit it or not, was to inspire people to be individuals and to think for themselves and to be, and I think that was part of that educated eye he brought to the world.
was he sensitive about advertisers? Like, that's what I'm really curious about, doing a Style Guy thing. Did he ever get you in trouble?
No.
No. But did he ever did you ever need for him to mention advertisers?
No.
No.
It was very much,
Separate.
that was almost like,
We were flush with advertisers
Yeah.
in those
Yeah.
days.
I know.
and that was Glenn's little,
Now?
he was like the corner guy at the bar who would just be talking at that point, so.
But he always was so conscious of advertising because he did advertising.
Yes.
So he was always, he got it, that you had to.
He knew the art and the commeress.
Yeah,
so
and
I
you
think
had,
that
and
was-
if you were a magazine, you had to
Yeah.
sometimes compromise a
I
little.
felt like back in those days, I never felt a lot of pressure. It was like the ads were like rolling
But
in.
in
They had
Condé
no
Nast,
other
they
place.
had pressure, don't you think?
Yeah.
In Condé Nast.
Glenn would come in and
In
tell
the
you all the great
90s?
ad campaigns he was getting paid for.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was,
Yeah.
and then you as an editor be like, how do I get that?
I felt it. I started feeling it later, a little bit later when we were getting squeezed more. But I felt in the early 90s.
I think what's interesting about Glenn's writing, probably for all of us, is I think also like he he made it appear, like you say, like
Yeah.
he made it look really easy, but it was
Very
not
much so,
easy.
yeah.
And I think that's, I always remember what he said he learned when he was young and working with Andy Warhol was, when Andy turned to him and said, like, going out at night to parties, like, oh, it's such hard work, right? And it's what Glenn, like, it looked dashed off, it looked easy, but I think it was there was a rigor to it all, and there was a rigor to his thought. And he said, like, you didn't edit him, but, and we were speaking earlier, you made the great point, your phrase was,
Everything with Glenn was a riff. He was like a jazz player.
right. And I think that was really a lovely way to describe him, because he would just take you, and you sort of, like, you didn't know where, but there was yet, like, the 12-minute solo, it was like, and then it all looped back, and, like, this is amazing. So but I think that rigor inside his writing was really inspiring.
And what he handed in, you would never touch because it didn't need touching.
Yeah.
What you were talking about, what you thought was interesting about Glenn insofar that he was such a good magazine writer, and how that it's almost like a literary form that is slightly vanishing, because long form journalism is really, who has a word for that?
Defunct.
Thank you.
But I mean, opinion writing is also, rare. So
Well, opinion writing, I mean, there's plenty of opinions out there right now.
no, but I'm talking about magazines.
No, I know.
Yeah.
In magazines, and it's about books, or it's about Instagram, or it's about Twitter. I mean, Glenn started using Twitter, which I thought was like, I'm sure he would have honed that at pretty well.
Well, that was one thing that was very interesting about him, actually, maybe even the most, is that, he adapted himself he was a chameleon. I mean, he edited interview, he was a great editor. He was a great writer, as we know. He was a great manager of other people. He edited stuff all through this until this decade. And he did advertising and creative direction.
Had a TV show?
He had a TV show. What am I missing? Gina, what am I missing?
Poetry.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and poetry.
Oh, stand up.
Stand-up, yes. Oh, and TV party, but also there was one more thing I
He
can't
did
remember.
stand-up?
And he did stand-up. Anyway, it was extremely rare at the time, but now it's sort of interesting because we live in a world where that kind of ability is a little bit more accepted or even encouraged, but not really. I mean, what could you speak to? I mean, to me, he's very much like a social media person, but 40 years too
Pre-social
early.
media.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Even before the digital age,
Yeah.
he was finding these different outlets for his,
I mean, he was.
It's a world now
was
where
like his
everyone's got a side hustle now, but Glenn was, again, he was so inspiring to me for many reasons, but he's like, why do you need a label for what it is? Just do it.
Yeah, just
right?
do it.
And I think that, again, was probably coming out of the factory training, which is, if you want to make a movie, you make a movie. If you want to write about art, you make art, and you don't wait to, like, get the business
permission.
card that says what
Yeah.
you do.
Yeah.
You just do it. And I think he pursued those interests in a great way. And I think there was inside that thinking about his writing, sort of like, I think part of what he's a very critical thinker, and I think that's a way of thinking that's not sort of, you don't see it much anymore. I mean, there's a difference between criticism and critical thinking.
I was just going
right?
to say, you see a lot of criticism and no
Yeah.
critical thinking. Yeah,
But
exactly.
he would name a perfume with one word
Right.
and get paid a lot of money.
Right.
And then he could
Yeah.
he get paid more money for one word than he would for a whole year of columns at a magazine that was independent or
Yeah,
like
I know.
paper.
I think one of the first places I discovered his writing was for the Barney's campaigns.
Yeah. His
didn't
Barney's
even know he'd
campaigns, if you
written
all
them.
don't know about them, they were brilliant, actually.
And he did Bergdorf's too, because I remember he got me to do something for a magazine that he edited at Bergdorf's.
Oh, yeah, me too.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember when he was. I still remember. I have it somewhere. I never even knew Glenn. Yeah, I was still pretty new in New York. But the New York Observer did a profile of him on page 1, and I was just like, this guy. And then I met him. But it was like he to me epitomized what a New York writer could be. You know, because he was just touching everything. And,
When he started doing advertising, you know, he was with Art and Commerce, and that I would love to see just a show of those words that he did for his clients, because they were all probably secret. No one wanted to know that he named
it's all...
the Dior perfume or whoever they were. I didn't even know what Calvin Klein perfumes. I don't know who, but he used to make names, right, for a lot of big brands. And
Didn't he name Smart Water? Or no, the tagline.
What was the tagline?
There was like Smart Water has a tagline. I believe that was Glenn, but the water with all the answers or something like that.
That's so funny. Yeah, but then they would never choose the smart one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's always the challenge.
That's always the
writing
challenge.
Advertising.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah. Well, you know, my own introduction to Glenn. I mean, I read his columns when I was a college student in the '80s, and but you know, when I moved to New York, I was friends with a young lady over here with blonde hair. I think that's you. Anyway, we were sitting in a bar, the Markham, on Lower Fifth Avenue, having a drink, and she was telling me about this guy that she was meeting for a drink, and for the first time. And I was like, oh, wow, it's interesting. I can't wait to meet him. And then Glenn O'Brien came in, and I was like, there's Glenn O'Brien is here. Because I knew who he was, and he was sort of an idol of mine. And then Gina said, well, that's who she's meeting. And then they got married. Isn't that a nice story? But so, to me, that was so quintessentially Glenn O'Brien, because it was like, there was something sort of magical about him. Like he had this charmed life that was kind of elevated from everybody else's. And yeah, he could write like a scathing, you know, blah, 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 and then, you know, name the new Dior perfume. Like those two things, you just don't get them together. There's two people exist, but not in one body, you know? And that was what I thought was really interesting about Glenn. I was pretty jealous of him, I have to say, but he did forward some work my way, so I was very grateful. He was always very kind. But, you know, he was a real study in contradictions. To me, he's like, now looking back, he's very traditional, but extremely groundbreaking too. And I feel like, do you guys feel like you see any contradictions in him, and what would they be? And please speak in complete sentences. No, I'm just kidding, don't worry. Alex, Michael?
Oh, let Michael
No, go
take
ahead.
this one.
Well, as I said earlier, I said some of those contradictions earlier, that he sort of, you know, but there was always, you know, I think it was he was very balanced. I mean, you could say he's contradiction, but there were two sides of him, and I think one of the great things, I mean, Gina mentioned just on his, you said one of his great things that he did that people don't really think about was he was a poet. And I think one of the things that I always appreciated about him was Glenn's, he had tremendous generosity. And I think there's a lot of people probably in this room who have encountered him where he would say, you know, he'd start those literary journals like Bald Eagle and other things, and he'd say, like, you should write a poem for that. You should do a sketch for that, right? And things that people thought, well, these are these small things I'm keeping on the side here. He would sort of pull that work out of you and make you believe in something that you could do. And I think.
Did you write a poem for Bald Eagle?
I did more than a few, yeah. I mean, and he sort of just like, he knew I was writing poems. Like, he said, hey, you think you should write some poems? Give me some poems. And I sent them, and it was like one of those, again, just great thrills, because I felt, you know, validated by his eye. And I think there's more than a few. And I think, you know, for a guy who was so talented and so successful, he was always giving out, and I think, and sort of sparking things in other people. So. Those are not contradictions. Those are just, as I said, I think the major one is that sort of like hated, you know, was never snobby, but could not stand phonies, you know. And
right. Yeah.
But he would have made music, I bet he would have loved to. Did he ever play any music? No?
No.
He DJ'd.
Another contradiction.
No, but I don't know.
I was just going to say something about the contradictions. I can't remember what it was. What's that?
Can move on from there.
Let's move on from that contradiction question. Alix, you had some thoughts about what makes his writing, like what makes it endure, you know?
What makes it
Yes,
us
what
want
makes
to like collect
yes,
it?
why would anyone want to collect this book?
I don't know. I cringe
That's
to think
what-
of things that I've written for magazines collected in a book. I sort of, I don't know, I appreciate the ephemeral nature of magazines where you put something out there and then they disappear. But I don't know. I feel like Glenn was always like, I don't know, building an oeuvre, to use a very big word, but I think one that certainly applies, and to kind of look back and hear or read the things that he was thinking at the time and how prescient so many of them are, and funny, and his just delivery is, I think, is something that you never tire of. It doesn't feel dated. He was a very
it's
sort of
amazing, actually,
modern modern thinker ahead of his time, and
You could run anything that he wrote for any magazine, any little thing, and it would be relevant right this minute. So it was, I mean, I just remember his memorial service, which was so wonderful, and it was just all his, people that he loved and cared about that were close to him, reading from different excerpts from his, and it was just incredible.
Yeah, it's heaven.
But it's when he was doing it, I don't know if people appreciated like when he would be in 1990s, but once it's, as you culled it together and you could just keep printing these books. They're amazing. I mean, this book is great.
Michael, what would you say, this book and Glenn, his example, like what example does he set to young writers today? I mean, what about his
I think
writing?
the thing that I would remind writers is, again, it looked very easy, but I think Glenn, he reported, he did the work. And again, I just, he mentioned this in different ways at different times. I mean, it was the Andy training, just you go out and you have to sort of like, if you're going to have this great canvas like New York City, if you're not out and experiencing, then, drawing it back in. And I think that was, I don't want to draw sweeping sort of.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I just think in a world now where you can, be on Twitter or just sort of blast out your thought or just react to other people are writing about, it's a different world. And it was a different training that I think, yes, it's a different time, but you can, I think, draw learnings from how Glenn came up. And there was always that rigor there. And I think there's a difference, but he was able to take that voice, which he created and found in himself, and then put it on Twitter or put it into any other sort of vessel that was the appropriate vessel for it to go into the world.
And so much of it was cultural commentary.
Yeah.
And
but you had to live in the culture to know what you were
But
talking
it
about.
didn't matter almost. I mean, but it was human commentary, but it was pop cultural commentary for sure.
Yeah.
So you could really get a sense of the moment, whether it was politics or whether it was like sex or whether it was like fashion or pretense or like whatever, like he captured that in cultural moment in his writing. I think he was always commenting on the culture that he saw in New York City, pop culture, I would say.
I still think it's the Jesuit training in him.
The Jesuit.
I just think he was always observing. He had the eye, and he was certainly participating in it. But I think there was, he's said to me many times, he's like, there's that part of him that was always looking at it with Jesuitical training. But that's not judgmental. That's
No,
simply
that's not judgmental. No, not at all.
That's again, I think, looking at it, does it work? The philosophical look at it.
He had a keen sense of smell. I mean, of cultural smell.
Well, one of the things what was great was that he didn't care what part of the culture he was writing about. I mean, he could write about art, fashion, music, film, politics, blah blah blah, and they were all the same. You know, art was more privileged than music,
Fashion.
and fashion wasn't some lowly thing. I mean, it was all the same.
Yeah.
Which,
And that's why I loved him, because that was my thing. I mean, that's what I lived for. That's what paper was about.
Any other parting thoughts about this?
I also think that there was part of that was, someone mentions, he was also unpredictable.
Yeah.
And I think not just in what he wrote, but sometimes I think you never knew which Glenn was going to show up at dinner, and that was also part of the fun of it, And but he could be tough on you, and
he could be tough.
And but I think he was sort of always responded if you pushed back a little bit on him, because he could get cranky.
He would get cranky. Yeah.
I think also the art and commerce thing was really interesting about Glenn, because most artists or like cultural, creative people are really bad at commerce, and Glenn always observed about that kind of juxtaposition, but he also participated in and wanted to kind of like, to conquer commerce
he didn't want
with
to be a
his
starving
words.
artist.
And I think his proudest thing probably was when he would write one word and get, I don't know what, $50,000 for one word of naming a perfume. I mean, that was probably like heaven for him,
Yeah.
But he was always, and he would always like clock the magazines writing about the advertise. He clocked it all. He was like, he knew where the bread was buttered, and he didn't hate it. He got it. He knew it. But I think that was another interesting facet of him.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because he had that kind of, East Village rabble-rouser side that,
Punk. He was a punk.
Yes, exactly. And then.
But he would go and work for like Louis Vuitton or whoever, Dior or whoever.
Exactly. Well, should we lock it down and ask some questions?
Definitely. Anybody have questions?
Who's going to do the audiobook?
Gina, who's going to do the
That's a very good
audiobook?
question.
Gina, who should do the audiobook?
What?
It couldn't be one person?
One person, I think different people would be good at reading different things.
Kind of like at his memorial, right? Yeah.
That's a good idea. Just redo his memorial.
Well, if he were 19 years old and just arriving in New York City from Cleveland, what would he do now? What would be the trajectory of his future career? Where would he find a home?
That's a great
Great
question.
question.
We were talking about this earlier. Who would like to take that question?
Oof, I know.
It's a hard one.
I don't know. I'd like to paraphrase something Glenn had written. It's like, I've seen the future of magazine writing, and I'm not going.
And I'm not what?
I'm not going. I don't know.
I'll read my famous thing my favorite thing, I should say. But how, in a nutshell, I believe the problem, he was talking, and this was in 2003, about just like how everybody was freaking out about everything, like what was wrong with society, whether it was drugs or whether all the things that were horrible that were happening. But he said, in a nutshell, I believe the problem is a pandemic lack of personal embarrassment, an affliction so widespread that it is no longer perceptible by the vast majority of the populace. I love that. But, I think he would be, I mean, I don't know, would he be on Instagram? Would he be doing a good Twitter? Would he be into Twitter, do you think, Gina? I think Gina wouldn't be able to also comment on that.
I think Glenn preferred Twitter over Instagram because he couldn't take good pictures. He was terrible at it. But he loved Twitter. In fact,
I could imagine,
the book has
right?
a bunch of his favorite tweets interspersed.
Yeah. But
But as a writer with a platform,
maybe he'd do a zine. I mean, I think zines are really, there's millions of zines now. I don't know.
But does that make it appealing or unappealing?
I don't know what he would.
I mean, it's hard to stick out, I think, is the
I think he would
issue.
still write.
Yeah.
He'd still write. He'd still write. He'd just have to find a platform to write. We all have to find a platform. I write. I do it on Instagram because that's my medium. But
I,
pardon?
Can you earn a living?
Well, Glenn could. I can't.
Glenn could always
Yeah.
find a way.
That 20-year-old.
Oh, the 20-year-old
Yeah,
who's
the
coming
19-year-old,
now.
exactly. Right.
If they can, if it was Glenn, I think they could. If it was the
Probably have a
20-year-old
TV
Glenn,
show.
I think he would figure
A
it out.
different kind of
He's
TV
smart. I don't know.
Right, yeah. Probably right.
You're kind of
TV
asking
show.
old people this. So.
I know, we're
I was
trying
like,
to
where are
figure
the young
out-
people in the
the
room?
old people are trying
Where are
to
the
figure
young
out
people here? Are there
what's next.
some?
He'd be an influencer. I'm not young, but he'd be an influencer. It sounds like.
Well,
Make money off of his branding, but on his own terms. That's what people do for money now that are savvy with it.
I don't think Glenn's too pure to be
Yeah,
an
I
influencer
mean-
somehow. Because influencers to me, a lot of them smack of phony. Sorry if there's
Yeah.
influencers in the crowd. But that to me is like the ultimate.
seems,
I'd
yeah.
love to actually read Glenn's take on influencer culture.
yeah, he would hate
That's
it.
what I
He
would
Oh
love
my God, I
to
would
read.
love
Yeah.
that.
There's certain writers you're like, I'd love to know what so and so thinks about that. And I think any of these sort of cultural phenomenons, influencer culture in particular,
I mean, if he was 20, he might not move to New York now.
Yeah,
he probably
that's
would
probably
live
true.
in LA or somewhere else. I don't know. It's like he probably wouldn't move here.
Yeah, I don't know. He might shun social media altogether in some, for some.
That's true.
And I mean, it's going to take some completely unknown tack for somebody who's famous in 20 years. They're not on Instagram now,
Yeah.
or maybe.
We don't know
they might
because
not
Glenn would have invented it. He would have. We need him here to invent that thing.
Yeah.
The 20-year-old Glenn. But
There are plenty of those, but it's
There's a question out there, though. No.
no.
No?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Not really a question, more commentary. I think there's two words come to my mind when I think of Glenn O'Brien. This one is humor, and the other one is transcendence. No matter the format, he will transcend, whether it's poetry or copywriting and advertising.
Can I ask you to speak up a little? I can't.
Yeah,
hear you.
sorry. Two words come to my mind: transcendence and humor. And I don't know, in the 80s, I think it was maybe an inflection point, maybe acceleration. Would there be an Andy Warhol without him, or even Basquiat without him? He transcended, he came from film and mastered in writing, image and writing, and art and commerce. So, what do you think?
I do think the humor is if that hasn't come through from us tonight, I would certainly agree with you, because I think it's that puckish punk wit he had, right, and provocateur, and I think he was always sort of, I think he also could have been a silent film star because he just had the face, right, and he deadpan, and he would just say things to you, and you would like, is this for real? Oh, it's and then the little mouth would curl up in the side, and I think he drew real delight from that. So I think for sure that sense of humor was, and that's what people loved in this book so much. I think is you're just always like that's funny, that's smart, and the wit was always, I think that's what made him a great cultural commentator as well. That he was able to see the humor, whether it was ridiculous or the sublime or somewhere in between about it all.
And I'm sure Andy was the one who inspired him.
Yeah.
Art and commerce. That was
Andy's
he taught
It's all
him
good.
everything.
Well, it's also just like, is it a joke or is it not a joke,
Yeah.
right? And it depends. Like, if you guys all think it's a joke, well, I'll laugh. If you don't think it's brilliant and you want to give me $1 million for it, let's do that too, right? So.
Yeah, it's not an or, it's an and.
And an and, yeah. It's a slash.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Is there somebody back there? I can't really
No, he's
see.
doing the touchpad. That's our mic guy.
Oh, okay.
I also would say, I think, again, when we talk about qualities, I think, just to put a point on it, I think Glenn was also very loyal to people. And I think that was, you know, he was loyal to you, but you learned how to value the loyalty he was giving to you and to treasure that. And I think because it did, he did return kindness, not even return, he would give out kindness in many ways. And I think that was, again, it goes back to sort of when I think about him, everyone thinks he was this New York cool, snobby, judgmental person. Yeah. And in fact, he was a very soft, I think, loving person there. And that's, you know, for many New York, most people in this room are probably New York transplants, and it's sort of, he never forgot that side of him, and it never grew a hard shell on it. You know, I think that was why he would wound easily oftentimes.
Why he would?
He would wound easily sometimes,
right.
you know.
Yeah.
But like all people, creative people, he was, I think, to create that much work and to put that much voice of your part of yourself in the world, you've got to be vulnerable, right? So,
I mean, you bring up something that you know, we've been talking about, and which I talk about constantly with other writers, which is, you know, as a writer consulting with brands on their content, you know, you run into this problem where everybody wants it as sterile as possible because nobody wants to get fired. You know, that's the goal of the content in the brand world. And that's not a happy way to make content. I don't even know how, if there's a happy way to make content. It sounds like making donuts. The stuff that you put into sausages.
It's also not a good way to make a brand.
Yes, right, exactly. But so one of the things that, you know, I experienced with Glenn, which was so special and amazing actually, was, you know, when he would edit me, like a lot of times he just forwarded work my way that he couldn't handle, which was wonderful, and I was very grateful for that. And then in a couple places he commissioned pieces from me, and instead of what I was used to, some editor calling and be like, oh, you have to take out this, you have to take out that, that's too much, don't say that, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, Glenn was like, make it funnier, go further, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, as a writer, you're like, what? What is happening? Like, this is such a strange thing. But that really, it's because Glenn always just pushed it. And with everything, I mean, he really pushed it. And that was, you don't see that now. Like, people don't do that. It's beaten out of you when you are, especially because you're a freelancer now and you're like, oh, I'm sorry, I'll do exactly what you want. So, I mean, it's, I think this is, to me, what the most important thing about Glenn was, like, you know, is courage, I might even say, or just kind of like, you know, no, fuck you. Like, this is what I'm writing, and like, this is what you're publishing. And he probably would not be as profitable today in the new forced content world. But I mean, he really should be a hero just for that alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, given the particular culture we're in right now, do you really, when you say things like you think Glenn would push it, do you think that we're in this current situation we're in now that Glenn could push it? I mean, I think he'd get crucified for writing a lot of things that he used to write now. I mean, it's you know, to sort of graft his experience onto our current times is sort of disingenuous, I think. I mean, I don't think that, and I also would wonder, and I love Glenn, by the way, but I also would wonder what he would think of the seriousness of this discussion. but I just don't think that he could push it now, and I think that's an important conversation to have.
That's what I'm saying, though. He couldn't push it now.
No, I thought you said he would push it.
Well, he would try, but he would fail.
I think it would be worse than that. I think he'd get crucified. I think it's. I think.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if he would get crucified. There's a short list of things that people get crucified for, and he's not particularly well known for addressing those things. But maybe you're right.
Well, no, but again, that's judging. I'm not trying to be argumentative, but that's making this assessment based on what he did when he was able to do it. I mean, if I'm just wondering now if he can get away with a real observation of current events and really speak his mind. I wonder if this environment would be conducive to it. I just don't know.
It really depends on what the content, to use our happy word, is of that thing. You could get a ticker tape parade for some very bold content, and then you could be, hung out to dry by your ankles for others. So, I don't know. I don't feel like you can make it one way or the other.
Well, right now, print is an antique technology. Many people think it's dying. And yet, Michael Zilkla chose to start a new publishing company, and he chose to start it with this book by this author, by Glenn O'Brien. Why?
I think, Michael, you have to
Michael, do you want to answer that question?
Definitely.
I don't think anybody else can.
Well, I think that when Glenn and I were coming up in New York in the late 70s and early 80s, it was a really generous, collaborative time. And when Glenn was sick, he asked me if I thought he was a good writer, and I told him I thought he was a great writer. But I knew that the reason he was asking that is because of the tension between art and commerce, and maybe, the sort of literary establishment hadn't taken him as seriously as they might because he could make so much money with one word. And so I promised him I would do this so that, this would be out there and that hopefully, the literary establishment would take notice. So that's why I did it. And then I turned it into, it's going to be a series because people keep coming back. If it's a series, at a certain point you have enough feet of shelf space that people have to take notice, or they go back, to the early ones. But it was really, what I wonder, that question about what it would be like coming to New York now, I don't know that it's as generous a time as it was then. And that was the big, big difference. I could not have stayed in the record business without Glenn's column writing about my bands because they were not selling at the time. But, but people kept coming because of, and it's the generosity that's gone now.
And to answer your question too, to echo his statement, people that are perceived as, artists that are perceived as being too commercial are never taken seriously for decades. It took Warhol decades to be taken seriously by the critical establishment. It's Jeff Koons still not taken seriously, but just starting to be.
He's laughing his way to the bank.
Yeah, but I once interviewed Jeff Koons and I asked him how it felt that academics didn't like his work, and I just thought he would say who cares? And he paused and he colored and he couldn't really answer it. And let me just tell you, trying to get Jeff Koons to go off script is really hard. So I was like, wow, oh my God, it was really a moment. But this is a real thing. The prejudice against artists that sell. And you see it with this book too. Not the book, but you see it with, I remember Glenn when he was alive, and he was frustrated that people didn't take him seriously as a writer. They should take him a lot more seriously than a lot of writers, let me tell you. Anyway.
It's also has to do with, because I'm really familiar with not being taken seriously, because when you deal with culture, Glenn wasn't one thing. When you're not one thing, it's people want you in a box, you know, and if you're not in a box, it's why Jeffrey Deitch got fired from Mocha, you know. It's like it's why Keith Haring was made fun of for Pop Shop. It's like why paper was always poor, because we never were like one thing. And you're not taken seriously if you don't. I don't know. If you deal with culture and the crisscross of it all, it's just somehow not as serious. And you know, the art world is so fucking like conservative and serious. I love the art. You know, what they put. You know, what's art? I mean, art is everywhere. It's not just what they put in the museums.
Right.
And that's why I love Jeffrey, because Jeffrey Deitch. Knows that art is more than that, and Glenn knew that art, you know, writing is more than that, and art and culture was more than that. So it's I don't know, am I making any sense?
No, it's perfect. I think I applaud everything you're saying, and it's important. I hope it wasn't disingenuous.
Thank you. Thank you. This is fascinating, and I'd echo what was said about Glenn being an authentic person and a nice person, and I'm sure that he would be successful today following his star, whatever he would do, because that's what he did. I first got to know Glenn in 1962. We were butting heads on the football field, trying out for the football team at St. Ignatius High School. And we made the JVs, and it was easy for the coaches to remember the second string guards, O'Connor and O'Brien. But in high school, Glenn was a person that seemed to have leapfrogged over puberty, because he was always mature and cool and composed, a very nice man, and sharp dresser for the day. Tab collar, very narrow tie, cardigan sweaters. And in New York, in the late 70s and early 80s, I was bartending at the Ear Inn, and Glenn would come in sometimes, and we'd talk, and I was pursuing the theater, and he was doing his magazine work and his other things. And one thing that wasn't mentioned, I remember him talking about a band he was in called Conelrad, so I assume he was a musician as well. And it was great to see him having his success. And I remember going out with him one night, and we must have made, I don't know, 4 or 5 stops in one night. It was very busy, and I think he was wearing a London fog raincoat and a little fedora. A little offbeat, but he made it work for sure. And I was so sorry to have missed his memorial service. To me, he was always a high school classmate and a friend and a regular guy. And I'm sure he'd be very happy to know that we're in his debt and remembering him the way we are.
Nice. Thank you.
That was a terrific memorial.
Yeah.
But coming from Cleveland and diving into this radically different world of New York, which is like a different planet, how in the world did he hook up with the Warhol scene?
What was the question?
How did he hook up with the Warhol scene?
Oh, the Warhols.
I don't remember any real particulars, but that's just what he was involved in, and it was part of his kind of encyclopedic approach to New York: music, art, culture, fashion, all these things, nightlife. And he never bragged about that kind of thing. This was his milieu. This was his beat. That's how I think he looked at it. So I didn't know about the naming of the perfume and things like that. It fits, because I can see him doing that kind of thing for sure.
Is this on? Actually, I can answer this. Glenn hooked up with the Warhol factory when he moved to New York in 1971. I think he and Bob Colacello went to college together, and then they both took jobs painting needlepoint canvases together, and they both went to Columbia grad school together. they were studying film. And their professor at the time was, one of them was Andrew Saris, who worked at the Village Voice, and he used to allow his best students to write film reviews. And so it was Bob who actually reviewed one of the Warhol films, and they called Bob into the factory and asked him to take over the magazine. And Bob said, "I'll only do it if my friend Glenn can do it with me," because the two of them used to edit the Georgetown Literary Magazine together.
That's amazing. I didn't know that.
Anyway, that's how it started.
There's a piece, I mean, I think it's online, I'm not sure, but when I was at GQ and Glenn, I was always fascinated to know the early Warhol factory stuff, because Glenn would tell these stories to dinner, and Human, who I see out here, heard them as well. And that was another great quality of Glenn, was he was a connector. And for years, I'd have drinks or dinner with Glenn. He's like, "You got to meet my friend Human. I think you guys would have a lot in common." And sure enough, he brought us together, and it was, again, that generosity. But on that Warhol thing, I'd say, I, of course, was just one, like, "Tell me more, what did you learn there, what did you do?" And he would tell these stories, some of you may know, for instance, where the cover of Sticky Fingers is Glenn's torso with that Andy shot with the Polaroid, and he'd tell these stories, and they would just like fall off the table like crumbs, right? And you like, "Why don't you, have you ever written that down?" "Well, who really, who knows, who cares, you know?" And so I leaned on him to just like pull this piece together, which was sort of like, you know, the working thought. It was like what I learned from Andy Warhol, my first boss, you know, because everyone has a first job. And it was I think it's online. I'm pretty sure it's, if GQ kept it up there, but it was a wonderful piece. I was glad I got out of him, because it sort of, you know, I think made him sort of distill some of those wonderful moments and answer some of those questions of like these 20-year-old kids. And then when he talks about, that's when he said, you know, it's like Andy turned to me like, "It's hard work to go out every night, and you've got to, you know, nightlife is hard work." And because that was what he learned. It was hard work. It was going out there. The interview was working on collecting gossip and bands and the nightlife scene and all that stuff that, you know, was, you had to go out and catch it, rather than now, of course, you can sit in your bed and scroll through Instagram feeds and just receive it. But that's a different, and it's not, it's not old man shouting at a cloud. It's just saying, you know, I think that was his training to go out and learn that. But it was to pull out I'll see if that piece is around, and I hope it is, but because it's a lovely little
For the next.
ode to that period.
Yeah, for the next one.
Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Why don't we take you down from the stage and everyone can talk to each other? We'll open the doors, you can get drinks in the cafe, but let's give our panel a big hand.
Okay.